What if the true terror behind the name Ivan the Terrible was not the wars he waged, but the punishments he personally designed for those who dared to cross him? This question opens a doorway into a world where absolute power fused with paranoia, and where a ruler's anger became a weapon far more frightening than any army. When we revisit the chronicles of Ivan the Fourth, we are not simply exploring distant history. We are stepping into the mind of a man who used cruelty as both strategy and personal satisfaction, reshaping the meaning of authority in medieval Russia. Imagine a court where every whisper could be interpreted as treason, where loyalty was never enough, and where the Tsar himself chose the method of your suffering. Ivan did not delegate brutality, he embodied it. His punishments were not merely political tools, they were expressions of a monarch convinced that fear was the only language his enemies understood. Understanding these acts is essential to understanding the world he built, a world where the boundary between justice and vengeance slowly dissolved until they became indistinguishable. But there is something even more unsettling. Many of Ivan's most brutal punishments were not reserved for armies or rebellions. They were deeply personal. Advisors, nobles, servants, even members of his own inner circle felt the weight of his suspicion. His rage did not strike randomly, yet it arrived with such force that no rank could shield someone once they fell under his scrutiny. This era of medieval terror reveals how a ruler's psyche can twist the fates of thousands, transforming fear into governance and cruelty into routine. As we walk deeper into these accounts, you may find that the real brutality was not only in what Ivan did, but in the reasons he believed he had to do it. These motivations shaped punishments that echo across time, challenging our understanding of leadership, power, and the darkness that arises when both are left unchecked. You might even recognize patterns that appear in more recent histories, as if the shadow of Ivan's methods never truly faded. Before we move forward, I want to hear from you. Have you ever read something about a historical figure that made you rethink everything you thought you knew about power? Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if this kind of deep historical exploration intrigues you, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. The path ahead reveals punishments that grew even more personal, more extreme, and far more disturbing than the chronicles dared to fully describe, pulling us further into the world Ivan shaped through fear and absolute control. The deeper we move into the chronicles surrounding Ivan the Fourth, the more we encounter a landscape shaped by coercion, dread, and the systematic destruction of trust. Among the many tools Ivan used to maintain dominance, forced confessions became one of his most reliable weapons. They were not simply methods to extract information, they were rituals of submission designed to break a person's identity until nothing remained except obedience to the Tsar. What began as an interrogation often turned into a demonstration of how far Ivan was willing to go to prove that his authority reached into the very thoughts of his subjects. Imagine a chamber where the walls absorbed centuries of screams, a place where men entered still believing they could defend themselves, only to discover that innocence held no weight once suspicion had settled upon them. Under Ivan's rule, the accusation itself was already a form of punishment. The more a prisoner resisted, the more elaborate the torment became, as if suffering were a language the Tsar demanded people learn. Chains, irons, and crude medieval devices were used not only to inflict pain, but to erode the will. Ivan believed that truth revealed under agony carried a divine certainty, even when it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to survive. But the true horror was not only the physical pain. Forced confessions under Ivan operated like a psychological labyrinth. Prisoners were often trapped in cycles of questioning that shifted unpredictably, as if the interrogators were testing not what the accused had done, but how easily they could be reshaped. The fear of giving the wrong answer was equal to the fear of staying silent. Many confessed to crimes that never existed, simply because surrendering one's voice seemed less terrifying than enduring the next stage of torment. In this environment, reality itself became unstable, replaced by whatever version of events Ivan wanted to hear. These confessions served a larger purpose within the machinery of power. They allowed Ivan to justify purges, executions, and the destruction of families, framing every act of cruelty as a necessary defense against enemies who might otherwise remain hidden. The records from this period reveal a ruler who believed that only by crushing resistance, before it emerged, could he secure his reign. And so confession became currency, extracted through suffering and used to legitimize further brutality. Each broken spirit strengthened the system that held Russia in its grip, making resistance not only dangerous, but unimaginable. As we continue exploring these mechanisms of fear, the forced confession stands as one of the clearest examples of how Ivan transformed punishment into a form of governance. It became a silent contract carved into flesh and memory, binding individuals to a ruler who demanded absolute submission. And yet, what awaited those who survived these chambers would lead us even further into the heart of his cruelty, revealing that the torment of the body was only one part of Ivan's increasingly personal approach to punishment. As the machinery of Ivan's authority tightened, the notion of punishment evolved into something far more symbolic than simple retribution. Among the methods he favored, bodily mutilation stood out not only for its physical brutality, but for its ability to permanently redefine a person's place within society. Under Ivan's rule, a wound was never just a wound. It became a public declaration, a permanent marker that the Tsar himself had judged you unworthy of your former life. These punishments carved a hierarchy of fear throughout the realm, turning the human body into an open record of obedience and disgrace. One of the most devastating aspects of these practices was their precision. Ivan chose methods that left survivors visibly altered, forcing them to carry the weight of his judgment everywhere they went. A man who had once commanded respect could be reduced to an object of pity or suspicion with a single blow. This was intentional. In a world where reputation shaped destiny, a mutilated face or branded skin served as an unending reminder of the Tsar's reach. Such punishments stripped individuals not only of physical integrity, but of their social identity, unraveling the networks of loyalty and honor that had sustained medieval Russian nobility for generations. Survivors often described the psychological aftermath as worse than the physical pain. To be marked by the Tsar was to exist in a new reality, where every interaction was tainted by the visible evidence of failure. Friends distanced themselves, families suffered collective shame, and rivals seized the opportunity to rise. In this atmosphere, Ivan's punishments became self-perpetuating instruments of control. Even after the wounds healed, the consequences continued to shape lives, creating a society where fear governed far more effectively than force alone. It was not uncommon for these marks to be used strategically, transforming individuals into cautionary tales. Ivan understood that a single wounded nobleman displayed at court could intimidate dozens of potential dissenters more effectively than any speech or decree. His punishments spoke a language that resonated through taverns, churches, and marketplaces. They told a story without words, a story in which defiance led not only to suffering, but to a loss of dignity that could never be repaired. The Tsar wielded this narrative as deftly as he wielded political power, ensuring that loyalty stemmed as much from terror as from allegiance. In many ways, these bodily punishments represented the merging of the personal and political within Ivan's methods. They allowed him to punish individuals while reshaping the society around them, creating a living archive of his authority etched onto human flesh. And yet, as brutal as these markings were, they were only one part of a broader system of humiliations and ritualized violence. The next layer of cruelty would strike not only at the body or the reputation, but at the noble foundations that had once defined medieval power, revealing how deeply Ivan intended to dismantle the structures that threatened his rule. As Ivan's reign deepened into paranoia and absolutism, the punishments he devised for the noble class grew increasingly ceremonial, almost theatrical in their execution. These were not impulsive acts of anger. They were carefully orchestrated displays of domination, staged to fracture the old structures of power that had once challenged the authority of Russian Tsars. To defy Ivan was not simply to face physical pain. It was to be dismantled piece by piece in front of the very peers whose respect once defined a nobleman's world. Through these ritualized punishments, Ivan weaponized humiliation with a precision that rivaled his most brutal physical methods. What made these punishments uniquely devastating was the way they blurred the boundaries between justice, spectacle, and psychological warfare. Ivan understood that the noble families held centuries of pride, lineage, and tradition. By striking at those foundations, he was striking at the core of their identity. Nobles were often forced to kneel before the court, stripped not of garments alone, but of the dignity that had elevated them above common subjects. These ceremonies transformed punishment into a political message, reinforcing the notion that no title, no ancestry, no achievement could place someone beyond the Tsar's reach. The rituals themselves varied, but a common thread ran through them, the intent to publicly invert the noble's status. Some were forced to serve in degrading ways, performing tasks meant for the lowest serfs, while courtiers watched in silence. Others were berated or mocked, their reputations torn apart through accusations that would haunt their families for generations. The psychological cruelty of these scenes often exceeded the physical violence that followed. Ivan's ability to choreograph humiliation demonstrated a level of strategic awareness that made his punishments not only punitive, but transformative, rewriting the social order before his court's eyes. Witnesses described these events as unsettling, not only because of their brutality, but because of the eerie calm with which Ivan observed them. His gaze alone was enough to silence entire assemblies, and nobles learned quickly that showing sympathy for the condemned could lead to their own downfall. This dynamic created an atmosphere where fear and obedience became the pillars of aristocratic life. Even those untouched by punishment felt its presence looming over every decision, every conversation, every glance exchanged in the halls of power. The impact of these ritualized humiliations extended far beyond the individuals who endured them. They instilled a collective trauma within the noble class, breaking alliances and encouraging suspicion among families who once relied on unity to influence the throne. Ivan had found a way to weaken his most powerful adversaries without raising an army. Through humiliation, he reshaped the aristocracy into a fractured body, unable to resist him effectively. And as these ceremonies became more common, they paved the way for even darker forms of punishment, ones in which personal vengeance and political strategy became nearly indistinguishable. Before we continue into those deeper and more disturbing layers of Ivan's cruelty, I would like to know your thoughts. What part of this ritualized humiliation strikes you as the most revealing about how power operated in the medieval world? Share your reflections in the comments so we can explore these dark chapters of history together. The deeper we descend, into the world, shaped by Ivan the Fur, the clearer it becomes that some of his most extreme punishments did not emerge from political necessity, but from eruptions of personal fury. Unlike the calculated humiliations inflicted upon nobles or the ritualized confessions extracted from prisoners, these punishments reflected a volatile inner world where suspicion, obsession, and rage collided. When Ivan's temper ignited, the boundary between ruler and executioner dissolved completely, and those caught in the storm faced consequences far more unpredictable than any formal decree. Ivan's anger was notorious even in his own lifetime, described by contemporaries as a force that could transform a calm court into a scene of terror within moments. Advisors who failed to anticipate his moods walked on a fragile line, knowing that a misplaced word or perceived slight could unleash a punishment designed with shocking creativity. These acts were personal in the most unsettling sense. Ivan chose the method, the timing, and sometimes even the audience, ensuring that the memory of his wrath would echo far beyond the victim involved. What made these episodes so disturbing was not only their cruelty, but their spontaneity, for no one could predict when suspicion would twist into accusation. Among the chronicles that survived, there are references to moments when Ivan blurred the roles of judge and tormentor, taking direct part in inflicting pain. These were not rare occurrences, but a pattern that reflected his belief that authority must be demonstrated physically, even violently. He viewed mercy as weakness and believed that fear was the strongest tool a ruler could possess. In these moments, Ivan acted less like a monarch protecting his realm and more like a man consumed by an internal conflict he could neither control nor escape. His punishments became extensions of his psychological turmoil, with victims chosen not just for political reasons, but because they embodied whatever anxiety or grievance haunted him at the time. The court learned to read the signs that preceded these eruptions. Silence would spread, servants would retreat into corners, and nobles would lower their gaze, hoping to avoid attracting attention. Yet even caution offered little protection. Ivan often interpreted neutrality as hidden defiance. The environment he created was one where fear fed suspicion, and suspicion fueled further acts of brutality. His punishments were not merely reactions to perceived threats. They were manifestations of a worldview where violence and control were inseparable. In this sense, each victim became a symbol, a reminder that the Tsar's power did not operate through predictable channels, but through the volatile whims of a ruler who believed that dominance required constant reinforcement. This unpredictable nature of Ivan's wrath reshaped the emotional landscape of the Russian court. Loyalty became a fragile concept, overshadowed by the understanding that personal safety depended less on allegiance and more on the unpredictable movements of the Tsar's mind. Every noble, servant, advisor, and guard lived under the same shadow, knowing that the next punishment could be sparked by an offense too small to name. And as these episodes multiplied, they began to influence not only the court, but the entire structure of Ivan's rule, preparing the ground for punishments that would strike even deeper at the foundations of authority and survival. Opposition to Ivan IV did not always come in the form of open rebellion. Sometimes it appeared quietly, in whispered disagreements, hesitant reforms, or loyal servants who simply hesitated at the wrong moment. Yet under the Tsar's increasingly paranoid gaze, even silence could be interpreted as a threat. Those who dared to resist him, whether intentionally or through the slightest gesture, faced consequences shaped not only by the severity of their supposed offenses, but by the intensity of Ivan's evolving distrust. This created a dangerous atmosphere where dissent was not crushed by armies, but erased person by person, through punishments designed to extinguish both resistance and hope. The fate of these individuals often unfolded in stages. At first, They were pulled from their positions, stripped of responsibilities they had held for years. This initial displacement served as the warning. It was the moment when the accused realized they had been noticed by the Tsar in the worst possible way. Many attempted to demonstrate renewed loyalty, believing that submission might repair the damage. But under Ivan's rule, once suspicion had taken root, recovery was nearly impossible. The distance between the first accusation and the final punishment was rarely long, for Ivan believed that swift action prevented the imagined plots he feared from gaining strength. Those condemned faced punishments carefully tailored to their rank and former influence. Officials who had shaped policy were often subjected to interrogations meant to unravel their networks, exposing anyone who had advised or supported them. Others were isolated, cut off from allies who feared being implicated by association. When punishment finally arrived, it came with a force intended to send a message. Resistance to the Tsar, no matter how small, carried a cost that extended far beyond the individual. This system of personal retribution did not merely remove opponents, but reshaped the boundaries of what the court considered safe behavior. What made these punishments especially devastating was the way they affected families and entire social circles. Ivan understood that power did not reside in a single person, but in the connections they carried. By targeting a nobleman's relatives or confiscating estates, he ensured that the consequences of defiance reverberated through future generations. Families that had once stood proudly at the center of Russian political life found themselves reduced to obscurity or exile, their fortunes dismantled in the shadow of one person's supposed disloyalty. Even those who had served faithfully for decades discovered that loyalty was a fragile currency under a ruler who measured devotion through fear rather than trust. The cumulative effect of these acts was profound. The court became silent, cautious, drained of the spirited debate and negotiation that had once characterized governance. Advisors learned that offering genuine counsel could be mistaken for criticism, and criticism could be reinterpreted as treason. This shift transformed the very nature of power in Ivan's Russia. Instead of collaboration, survival became the guiding principle. Instead of loyalty, self-preservation shaped decisions. And beneath all of this lay the understanding that the Tsar's punishments were no longer tools of statecraft alone, but reflections of a deeper descent, one that blurred the line between political necessity and personal obsession. Humiliation was one of even the fear's most insidious weapons, a form of punishment that did not rely on bloodshed to inflict permanent damage. While physical torture left visible scars, humiliation carved wounds that lingered in memory, reputation, and lineage. Under Ivan's rule, public shame became a strategic tool, designed not simply to punish an individual, but to extinguish the influence of entire families. It was a method perfectly suited to a ruler who believed that fear alone could preserve his power, and that by dismantling a person's dignity, he could dismantle their authority just as effectively as through violence. These acts of degradation often unfolded in front of the court, where silence and forced compliance amplified their cruelty. A noble stripped of his status was forced to confront the eyes of those who once treated him as an equal. Ivan manipulated these moments with chilling precision, knowing that the nobility valued honor more than life itself. To be humiliated publicly meant to lose one's social standing, to become an object of whispered mockery and private suspicion. In a society built on hierarchy, such a fall was devastating, and Ivan understood that humiliation, once delivered, could not be undone by apology or pardon. It lingered as a stain that reshaped a family's future. Some punishments targeted symbols of identity. Noblemen were forced to wear garments that marked them as fools or traitors. They were made to perform tasks associated with the lowest classes, not because the work itself mattered, but because the act of performing it in front of their peers shattered the illusion of untouchable privilege. Others were paraded through the streets, exposed to the judgment of common citizens who took careful note of every gesture, every expression of fear or shame. This public dimension ensured that humiliation spread far beyond the palace walls, entering the collective memory of the nation. What made these methods particularly destructive was the way they extended to families. A disgraced noble's relatives were tainted by association. Marriages were cancelled, alliances dissolved, and long-standing political ties evaporated overnight. Children grew up bearing the burden of their parents' shame, often denied opportunities that their birthright should have guaranteed. For Ivan, this collateral damage was not an accidental byproduct, but a deliberate strategy. By corrupting the reputation of a single individual, he dismantled the social infrastructure that supported them. The humiliation became a generational sentence. At court, the threat of public disgrace created a culture of suffocating caution. Every word, gesture, or even silence was measured against the possibility that Ivan might interpret it as insolence. Nobles learned that survival required not only obedience, but the constant performance of loyalty. The space for dissent, already narrow, disappeared entirely. What remained was a fragile nobility reshaped by fear, fragmented by paranoia, and perpetually haunted by the possibility that they might be chosen next for humiliation. In this environment, power no longer depended on wisdom or leadership, but on navigating the unpredictable currents of the Tsar's expectations. Before we move on, I would like to hear your perspective. Which aspect of these humiliations do you think had the most lasting impact on the people living under Ivan's rule? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore how these dark strategies shaped history. Long before the physical punishments were carried out, long before torture chambers echoed with screams or noble reputations were shattered by public disgrace, fear had already woven itself into the fabric of Ivan's rule. Psychological terror was not merely an accessory to his methods, it was the foundation that made his brutality so effective. Through rumor, unpredictability, and the constant suggestion of invisible threats, Ivan created an atmosphere where anxiety did the work of 1,000 soldiers. People obeyed not because they were struck, but because they feared they might be. This invisible pressure became one of the most efficient forms of domination in his expanding arsenal. Ivan understood intuitively that the mind could be broken long before the body ever was. He employed spies, informants, and fabricated accusations to erode trust among families, councils, and entire communities. No one knew who might be listening or which harmless conversation could be twisted into an act of treason. The uncertainty became a kind of slow poison that seeped into daily life. Friends shared guarded words, servants whispered cautiously, and even the closest relatives began to fear that innocent remarks could be used against them. This internal erosion of trust was one of the most successful psychological weapons Ivan deployed. Adding to this terror was the Tsar's mastery of unpredictability. One day, he offered gifts or generous praise. Next, he punished the very same individuals for imagined disloyalty. This inconsistency distorted the court's sense of reality, teaching nobles that nothing, loyalty, achievement, lineage, provided true security. When punishment seemed random, compliance lost its meaning, leaving fear as the only constant. That instability reshaped the emotional rhythm of the empire, trapping the population in a perpetual state of alertness. Even silence became dangerous, because silence could be interpreted as hidden dissent. Ivan further amplified this terror by isolating individuals before striking at them. He removed advisors from their duties, summoned nobles to private chambers without explanation, or sent messages implying suspicion without revealing the supposed offense. These tactics forced victims to confront their own imaginations, often inventing crimes they feared they had unknowingly committed. The dread of not knowing became more oppressive than the punishments themselves. People awaited judgment not with hope of innocence, but with dread of inevitability, convinced that the Tsar had already decided their fate long before they were accused. This psychological pressure extended beyond the elite. Townspeople learned to avoid questions, avoid conversations, avoid attention. The mere presence of the oprichniki, a black-clad force loyal to Ivan's darkest intentions, was enough to silence entire communities. Their appearance did not guarantee violence, but it guaranteed fear, and that alone reshaped the daily behavior of thousands. The empire functioned under a shared intuition that danger could emerge at any moment, from any direction, without warning. Such a climate did not require constant brutality to sustain itself. The threat alone was sufficient to maintain obedience. Yet even this pervasive terror was only part of Ivan's complex strategy. While psychological fear paralyzed the masses, the Tsar devised punishments that manifested his obsessions in increasingly twisted ways. The next stage of his brutality would reveal how deeply paranoia had fused with authority, blurring the boundaries between governance and obsession. As the years progressed, Ivan's punishments ceased to resemble responses to disobedience and began to mirror something far more unsettling, the inner spiral of a ruler losing himself to obsession. Power, once a tool meant to stabilize the realm, slowly distorted into a lens that magnified every fear, every imagined betrayal, every shadow that crossed his mind. Ivan's authority no longer operated through recognizable systems of justice or political strategy. Instead, it followed the contours of his psychological descent, taking on a shape that blended paranoia with a compulsive need to control every aspect of life within his expanding domain. The chronicles reveal a man increasingly convinced that threats existed everywhere, that enemies were always hidden just beyond reach, waiting to strike. Instead of easing his burdens, power amplified his anxieties. Every whisper became suspicious. Every hesitation felt like proof of treachery. Every expression in the eyes of a noble could be reinterpreted as the beginning of a plot. It was this state of mind that transformed Ivan's punishments from brutal instruments of authority into manifestations of obsession. His actions were no longer simply reactions to events. They were attempts to force the world into alignment with his fears. This destructive transformation became most evident in punishments that lacked any semblance of logic. Individuals who had long served faithfully were suddenly targeted, their past loyalty erased by Ivan's shifting interpretations of their motives. Familiar faces became symbols of threat, not because they acted against him, but because Ivan's internal narratives reimagined them as potential dangers. In this environment, the line between reality and perception blurred completely. Punishments were now dictated, not by evidence or political necessity, but by the narratives Ivan constructed within his own mind. The consequences reached far beyond the palace walls. As Ivan's worldview grew increasingly distorted, the population adapted in desperate attempts to match his expectations. Nobles altered their speech, their gestures, even their expressions, hoping to avoid triggering suspicion. Advisors learned to anticipate moods rather than policies, shaping their counsel around the fluctuations of Ivan's emotional state. This transformation infected every layer of governance, turning public service into a delicate performance of survival. The empire itself seemed to reorganize around the instability of its leader, mirroring his internal chaos. Yet perhaps the most devastating aspect of this obsession was the way it consumed Ivan's personal relationships. Those closest to him, family members, trusted confidants, childhood companions, found themselves vulnerable to the very paranoia that guided his punishments. Acts of affection could be interpreted as manipulation, and gestures of loyalty could become evidence of hidden ambition. The tighter Ivan tried to control his world, the more it fragmented. Punishments that once served to reinforce power now exposed the fractures within his rule, revealing a man whose authority had become inseparable from the fears that tormented him. By this stage of his reign, Ivan's obsession had reshaped not only the mechanisms of punishment, but the identity of the Tsar himself. Power, once a symbol of stability, had become a mirror reflecting every distorted thought that crossed his mind. And it is within this dark transformation that the most unsettling punishments of all would emerge, revealing the full extent of how paranoia, authority, and cruelty fused into a legacy that would haunt Russia long after his death. By the final years of Ivan's rule, the punishments he crafted were no longer isolated acts of cruelty, but threads woven into the fabric of his entire legacy. They shaped how future generations remembered him, how chroniclers wrote about him, and how Russia itself understood the nature of authority. These punishments were not just events, they were signals that revealed the transformation of a ruler who once sought stability, but descended into patterns of violence that reshaped his world. Each act left an imprint that extended beyond its immediate victim, influencing the collective consciousness of a nation now defined by the shadow of its first Tsar. Ivan's most extreme punishments, those driven by personal rage or constructed through obsessive fear, became stories whispered through the centuries. They demonstrated with astonishing clarity how absolute power, when fused with insecurity, can mutate into a force that consumes both ruler and realm. His actions created a landscape where trust collapsed, communities fractured, and a culture of suspicion took root so deeply that it influenced governance long after his death. People learned to survive by navigating not the laws of the state, but the volatile currents of a ruler's emotional state, a legacy far more destructive than any battlefield defeat. These brutal practices also reshaped the political structure of Russia. Ivan's systematic targeting of nobles, advisors, families, and entire regions weakened traditional forms of resistance that had once balanced the monarchy. His reign left behind a power vacuum, filled not by unity, but by fear and silence. Whole generations inherited the consequences, living in the wake of a ruler whose punishments blurred the meaning of justice and authority. It is within this aftermath that we see how the ideology of fear can survive even after the man who created it is gone, shaping a society that continues to echo his patterns. At the same time, the emotional dimension of his brutality cannot be overlooked. His punishments reveal a ruler deeply at war with himself, a man shaped by trauma, abandonment, and a violent childhood that forged the mindset he carried into adulthood. Understanding this does not excuse his actions, but it allows us to trace the roots of a tragic evolution where personal wounds became national wounds. Ivan's reign shows how unresolved fear can transform into tyranny when paired with absolute power, creating cycles of cruelty that extend far beyond the life of one individual. As we step back from the darkest corridors of this history, the significance of these punishments becomes even clearer. They shaped not only the political identity of medieval Russia, but also the psychological landscape of its people. The echoes of Ivan's brutality became part of the nation's cultural memory, a reminder of what happens when power loses its boundaries and the human mind becomes the battlefield on which an empire is ruled. And in examining these stories, we see reflections of patterns that reappear throughout history, warning us how easily authority can slide into obsession when left unchecked. If you have stayed with me through this entire exploration, it shows how deeply these historical shadows resonate. I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment saying the phrase, "This story reached me," so I know you followed this journey to the end. And if this kind of historical insight adds something valuable to your day, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to support more content like this. There is another video waiting for you right here that expands on the themes we uncovered. So click and continue this exploration with me as we move deeper into the hidden corners of history.